We haven't seen her, except for that one.
Hello there. We're ready.
Listen up!
I'll tell you, on behalf of the Archibald Smith Museum, we'd like to welcome you here when some came out. And Linda's going to do a presentation on the steamship of the Hungarian. We have water, tea, coffee, and donuts. Feel free to get up and help yourself. So I'll turn it over to Linda.
Thank you. I think everybody knows me, but if anybody doesn't, my name is Linda Symonds. I'm not an expert on this wreck or any wreck. It's probably the wreck we know the least about, but so I kind of jokingly call this presentation the presentation of what I know nothing about. So I'm going to talk tonight about, as Blanche said, the story of the steamship Hungarian that was lost on the ledges of Cape Sable, and I have here February 19th, 1860. It may have been February 20th, we don't really know, because we don't know what the time frame was. Maybe it was a minute before midnight, or maybe it was 3 minutes after midnight, so we don't know if it was technically the 19th or the 20th. But it happened some time on that night between the 19th and 20th. And this is just an artist's impression of what the Hungarian would have looked like. There aren't any pictures that we can find in the archives of the actual ship Hungarian, although it had several sister ships, and there are some photos of them. So you can see it's a three-masted ship, and it has the smokestack because it was a steamship. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why was the Hungarian doing what it was doing in order to try and unravel the story of how it came to be wrecked. Because we don't know how it came to be wrecked. There were no logs or anything. There was nothing to tell us that was salvaged. So it's all speculation. But one of the speculations is about this fast service. So fast service was something that in the 1850s, they wanted to get the Royal Mail from England to Montreal quickly. And so they started talking about this fast service. And the route was between Liverpool and Portland, normally, until they decided, well, if they went into Quebec, into Montreal, they would save 500 miles, and they would have 750 miles on the St. Lawrence Seaway, which is smoother sailing. So they decided that they would try to get into Montreal in the summer and Portland in the winter. And then the Portland Railway was built in 1852, which would deliver mail or cargo from Portland into Montreal. So that was what started this whole fast service of mail. In 1853, the first contract was struck between the Canadian government and a firm called Messrs. McKean, McLarty, and Lamont. And they were to carry Her Majesty's mail twice a month into Quebec in the summer and into Portland in the winter. And they used a fleet of screw steamers that included the Genova, Sarah Sands, Ottawa, Lady Eglinton, Cleopatra, and Charity. They were to receive from the government £1,238 per sailing, if they met certain conditions, and only if they met those conditions. One condition was that they had to average not more than 14 days on the westward voyage, or not more than 13 days on the eastward voyage. The goal was never reached in the first year of service. So the Cleopatra and the Ottawa were then added in year 2 in hopes of making faster times. The Cleopatra took 43 days to Quebec, and the Ottawa got stuck in the ice on St. Lawrence, and it finally had to leave and go into Portland. So not real success stories. They tried this for 2 years, and after 2 years, the goal of the fast service didn't work out, so the contract was cancelled. This set stage for another company to come in, and Hugh Allen, being a shipping owner and so on in Montreal, he decided that he thought he could fulfill a fast sailing. with his ships, or with ships. So he started a company called the Montreal Ocean Steamship Company, and they commissioned two pretty little iron screw steamers called the Canadian and the Indian. They were 270 feet long and they weighed 1,700 tons. The Canadian made her first voyage to Canada from Scotland, where it was made, and where it was then decided that they would be used as transport ships in the Crimean War. So the fast service didn't happen for a few more years. But during that time, the Canadian and what's the other name? The Canadian and the Indian proved themselves to be fast little ships. So after the war, the government again advertised tenders for this fast service to carry the mail. And the contract was this time awarded to the Montreal Ocean Steamship Company under Hugh Allen. And by now he had managed to buy out all his other partners, and he was basically the sole owner and renamed it the Allen Line. So the new fast service under the Allen Line was commenced in April of 1856 and runs between Liverpool, England and Montreal in the summer, or Portland in the winter. The first fast service was actually a fast service, but under the Allen Line. So the Allen Line contract was to provide the service every 2 weeks in the summer and once a month in the winter, and they would receive £25,000 a year for the mail delivery. The service started in April of 1856 with the ships, the Canadian and the Indian, and two similar ships that were also built by the same builders in Scotland, the Dennies of Dunbarton, Scotland. They were named the North American and the Anglo-Saxon. So under the Allen Line with these four ships, they actually started getting fast service. The ships were able to actually provide service within the 14-day window. The government was very happy, and so they decided that in 1858 they would do weekly service. So the Allen Line doubled its fleet of ships, and they got 4 new ships built from the same builder in Scotland, except that these were a little bit bigger. They were 300 feet long and 2,200 tons, and those 4 ships included the Hungarian. So how fast was the fast service? The Allen Line fleet of ships, they made speeds of between 11 and 13 knots in good weather, and even in bad weather they seldom went below 8 knots, which is pretty good. The average passage time from Liverpool, England to Montreal was 11 days and 5 hours. Pretty impressive considering that the other ones were, 43 days and stuck in the ice. And so they were having a little more success than the previous contractors. Eastward voyages averaged a time of 10 days and 10 hours. The fastest passage westward, and this was into Quebec, took 9 days and 5 hours for, transatlantic crossing. Eastward, the fastest passage was by the Hungarian, and it took 9 days and 14 hours. So we can see that this whole thing is setting up. We're going to get faster and faster, and we need to make time and all this. And this all comes into play about the speculation of what happened to the Hungarian. And that's why I'm kind of going into a little bit of this history of the fast service. In 1859, there was a lot of immigration. There was a lot of reason to be bringing things back and forth across the Atlantic. So there were now 12 shipping lines that were doing this transatlantic crossing. And because of that, they had to spread the available freight between a lot more ships. So the Allen Line asked for an increase in their subsidies, and they were granted an annual subsidy of £50,000. And if you remember a slide a few months back, their contract was only for £25,000 per year to bring the mail. So now they're getting another $50,000. So they were doing a good job. But that success for the Allen Line came at a cost. They were supplying fast service, to be sure. But between 1856, when they started providing the service, and 1885, they had lost 14 ships. They lost the Canadian in June of 1857, and that was lost at Village Lighthouse in Quebec. There were no lives lost in that wreck. The Indian they lost in 1859, December of 1859, and that was lost off Marie Joseph Harbor, Nova Scotia, or Mary Joseph Harbor.
Where is that?
It's just a little bit east of Halifax. There were 23 lives lost, and that's a whole story in itself, that whole story of the Indian. There was a lot of looting that happened. The captain left the ship and went ashore, and that allowed looters, and it was just a fiasco. And there was lots and lots and lots of bad press for the Allen line. But the Hungarian, if we go back to the Hungarian, the final voyage of the Hungarian, she left Liverpool, England on February 8th, 1860. And she was going into Portland, Maine because it was a winter sailing. She was under the command of Captain Thomas Jones. And all accounts that I can find, and the accounts, newspaper clippings and so on, seem to suggest that Captain Thomas Jones was a fine captain. There was no scandal, there was nothing that said, well, maybe Captain Jones wasn't really up to snuff or anything like that. She left Liverpool and called at Queensland, Ireland, and then on February 9th, 1860, departed from Ireland. And then on the night of February the 19th or 20th, during the early morning hours, she wrecked on the ledges of Cape Sable with a total loss of life. So this is what we know about the ship, the Hungarian. It was named the SS for steamship, Hungarian. The owner was the Allen line. It was built in 1858 in Dunbarton, Scotland, and it wrecked in February of 1860. So it was only 2 years old. As I mentioned before, it was 298 feet, 2,200 gross tons, and 38-foot beam. The propulsion was steam screw propeller. On one of the voyages, just before the wreck, just a few months before the wreck, in November of 1959, on November 9th, the Hungarian was crossing the Atlantic and it spotted a vessel in distress in a strong northerly gales and high seas, and this was just off the Grand Banks off Newfoundland. There was a crew of 7 men lowered in a lifeboat, and they headed over to the vessel. Upon arriving at that vessel, they were told that the ship was in distress, and it was also carrying survivors that had been picked up from another wreck. So this schooner, the John Martin, had its own crew, but also a crew of another schooner. So the John Martin was sinking and it was abandoned, and its 43 passengers, crew, passengers, and so on from both ships, included 23 women and children, and they were taken over to the Hungarian. And while they were being brought up into the Hungarian, Chief Officer Hardy, he was knocked overboard while he was helping the passengers to board the Hungarian. He couldn't swim, but he managed to haul himself aboard via a rope, and he survived his ordeal. And the rescue crew and the passengers were taken to the port of St. John's, Newfoundland. That was just 3 months before the Hungarian was lost. So the passengers of the John Martin were so happy to be on land that they took up a collection and they gave 2 gold coins to each of their rescuers. And they commissioned silver cups to be made for them from a jeweler in England. Now, unfortunately, those silver cups were never presented to their rescuers because they were all lost on the Hungarian on Cape Ledges. And this is a painting that's at the Archel Smith Museum. It was done by Sid Smith's brother, Gerald. This Gerald, right? Yeah. If you haven't been in there to see it, it's just that painting alone is worth going in. It's beautiful. But it shows what's really happening on that ship that night when it was on the ledges. The seas were going over the ship, and it was a terrible ordeal. We don't know a whole lot, and this is what I said when I started the presentation. This is the presentation that's kind of the presentation of what I don't know. I know a few facts, and that they're basically this, that the Hungarian struck the ledge, and it was lost, and there were no survivors. That was either on late night, February 19th, or early morning, February 20th. The weather was stormy, and there was no assistance that could be given from land. So everyone was lost.
Were there weather records in those times?
Well, we know that from the newspaper reports, basically, because I don't think that there were any weather records per se, like we would have today, but the weather reports did all seem to say the same message, that, you know, the newspaper clippings and so on. There aren't very many facts because, of course, we have none of the ship logs, we have nothing to tell us anything, we don't have anything. There was no distresses, there were no logs or anything. So most of what we know about the shipwreck is from local folklore, some newspaper reports, and a few books. And there's information that's published that seems rather questionable. There's also things written about the wreck of the Hungarian that we know to be false. For instance, we know that this is absolutely untrue. This is passages in both of these two books, the steam navigation and its relation to the commerce of Canada and the United States, and Ravenscrag, the Allen Royal Mail Line, those two books, both state that the light at Cape Sable was not lit that night because the lightkeeper was ill, a fact he confessed on his deathbed. Well, we know that the light was constructed in 1861 as a result of there being the wreck of the Hungarian. So we know that to be false, but that's published in two books. So our best guesses of what happened to the Hungarian. All the accounts seem to agree that there were westerly gales and snow squalls. And that made any attempt at rescue practically impossible. The ship may have struck the horse race and been damaged. And Blanche has over here a map showing shipwrecks around Cape Sable. And it has the Hungarian placed near the horse race. So potentially it could have struck the horse race and been damaged. Sid Smith has speculated that it may have lost its rudder on the horse race. But that's speculation, we had nothing to prove it. And it may have been trying to get into Clark's Harbor or into the lee of the island or something, because it ended up presumably on Hungarian rock, one would suspect, although we don't know that for sure either. The newspaper report says the Great Rip in one instance, or Cape Ledges in another instance. So, but I mean, Hungarian rock would have been named by local people some point after that, obviously. So I would presume, my personal opinion would be that if people are calling that Hungarian rock, that's probably where the Hungarian came to rest. But that's speculation. So this is just a little map that I've downloaded off the internet, and I've circled a few little places. You can see in the yellow circle, that's the horse race. The orange circle would be Cape Ledges, and Hungarian rock is up here in the purple circle. Sorry, Derek, I'm moving around on you. So, I wouldn't actually mind hearing from some of the fishermen in here what their thoughts are on that. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit later, because they know these ledges and things a lot more than I would. So what we think is most likely to be true, and this was taken from the Yarmouth Tribune newspaper, and it's a quote: "The ill-fated steamship is reported to have been seen by a coastal vessel off Liverpool, Nova Scotia, about 6 p.m. on Sunday." That would have been February the 19th. "She was apparently steering northwest, 25 miles from the coast, must have been nearly 4 points off her true course." So it would seem from that report that it was off course. And there are newspaper reports that a Barry Nickerson of Southside reported seeing lights in the vicinity of the horse race at approximately 3 a.m. and that these lights were standing still. They weren't moving. And then at about 4 a.m., Henry Nickerson and his son, and this is again from newspaper reports, at 4 a.m., Henry Nickerson and his son, who lived on Fish Island, saw lights of what appeared to be a ship in distress. And this was, it said on the Cape ledges. Now, they took a small boat from Fish Island and they went over to the Cape with lanterns and held them on the beaches in hope that if any survivors did make it off the ship, if the lifeboats did get away, that at least they would know what direction to move in, to come toward the lights. And these are some accounts of February 20th, that Harry Nickerson claims to have seen a light of a ship in distress, and that at daybreak, now remember he'd gone on the Cape, and he had his lanterns, so this was before daylight. And then at daybreak, the lights disappeared. Probably it was felt that it was due to the fall of the mast to which the lights were attached. And as daybreak came, they could see the hull of a huge steamer on the Great Rip. At this point, the foremast was gone, the main mast and the mizzen mast and the smoke pipe were all still standing at daybreak. And the seas were breaching the ship, just like in the painting. The newspaper reported that there were 50 or 60, and that's a quote, 50 or 60 people who could be seen in the rigging of the mainmast. And by half an hour after sunrise, the mainmast was seen to topple into the sea, taking the people with it. And then the smokestack began to lean forward, and shortly after that was gone from sight as well. The hull was nearly submerged, and the mizzen mast lasted only about another hour before it too fell into the sea. So it didn't take long for the steamship to break apart. The seas were terrible, and by noon, the ship's hull was even beginning to break apart. And articles from the ship were starting to appear in the surf. And then with the ebb tide, they were washed toward Back Row. By that night, the winds had calmed down, and the men with boats went out to what was left of the wreck. There were reports of some bodies being recovered. We don't know how many, we don't know who. There was one report of a man who was thought to be the ship's fireman being washed ashore at Shag Harbour, and a female child of about age 2 that washed ashore at Stony Island. We don't know how many bodies, as I said, were actually recovered. We do know that some were buried in the Old Town Cemetery in Clark's Harbour. That's at the corner of Main Street and Courtney Street, which is Swims Point Road. And there are reports that some bodies were claimed by relatives from the US and up in Canada and taken back for burial. But we don't know, again, we don't know who and we don't know how many. We know that there were some bags of wet mail that were salvaged, and they were forwarded on to Halifax, and they were taken by train. No, they were taken by ship, so that it would be a gentler ride for them than sending them over the horse and buggy mail line. It was all wet. They didn't want it to go to pulp. Whether or not they salvaged any, I don't know. On Wednesday of February 22nd, so 2 days later, word had made its way to Halifax, and the government had commissioned W.T. Townsend to go and make arrangements for the salvage, and sent the government schooner Daring was sent to the scene. Now, salvage was a big issue because of what happened with the Indian that was partially wrecked. The ship itself was salvaged, but there was a partial wreck. And what happened with that is there were gangs of men that went out from Halifax, because it wasn't far from Halifax, or at least this is what the locals said, that it was men from Halifax that came and looted the ship, and they took off everything that they could carry while the captain was ashore. So it was a real black eye for the Allen line and for the government as well. So they wanted to make sure that didn't happen again. So they were very diligent and quick in getting someone to this wreck site. And from that point on, it was really all about salvage and insurance. So E.W.B. Moody of Yarmouth was the agent for Lloyd's of London, and that was the insurer, and he arrived on the 23rd, so it didn't take long for people to get here protecting salvage, but you know, the locals did have 2 days to collect what they could collect.
Chairs.
Chairs, a spoon, several little items over there. Now, that doesn't mean that that was actually picked up off the beaches. That may have, or you know, that may have been salvaged from the wreck site or whatever. Those persons dispatched, particularly from the government, they were sent to prevent the looting and collect as much of the stuff as possible. And as I said, the looting of the Indian just a few months before that had been really vicious, and they didn't want to repeat. This is the best passenger or list of those on boards that we have. I don't think it's very good. I don't think it's very complete. I'll give you a second to kind of just scan through the names so you can see anybody you recognize. So we can see on there that there was a woman and child, Mrs. Delaney and child. So it was listed 22 cabin passengers. Now steerage passengers who didn't have cabins, they weren't necessarily recorded. So there wouldn't necessarily be a list of them, even if we had a better list, or the purser's list. Steerage passengers from Liverpool, there were only 14 according to this list. Again, I doubt that this is complete. But there were a lot of young people there. There was a child, age 2, a lot of 22, 26, 24-year-olds, 18-year-olds. So immigration was a thing at that time. People were coming to the new world, make a new life. They picked up 10 passengers in Ireland. The officers listed, there were 15 of those, so Thomas Jones was the master, and we have a little bit more information on these of who they were. And the third one down we see William Henry Hardy, age 31. He was the officer who fell overboard rescuing the people on the schooner on the Grand Banks, but managed to get himself back aboard the Hungarian.
It's interesting to note that a few of those names are found in this area.
Yep. It is, but we know that there are no descendants of these people.
That's right.
Because they were lost. Yeah. But they were young. I mean, we've got 21-year-old, 23, 27, 32, 33. They were young people. Terrible loss. And 5 engineers who were also lost. So from those lists that I just showed you, that totals 66 people. Now, estimates from the news reports of the day were estimating between 130 and 360 people, depending on which report you read. The purser's log was never found, so we don't really know, but 205 seems to be the most quoted number. It's used in our own literature when we do things here on the island. So I don't know where that number 205 comes from, but it's what we've always used. So just a little bit about the value of the ship and the goods that it was carrying. The ship was valued at $1 million, and it was only insured for 3/4 of that amount. The cargo was $1 million. The ship was valued at £50,000, which would be about $250,000, but it was only insured for $40,000. And much of the salvaged merchandise was auctioned off locally, and there are ads you can find in the old papers, bits of ads that would be such and such general store, auction, Hungarian salvage or something like that, and so you could see that the local merchants were selling that. So, as I said, we don't really know the reason for the wreck, but there was some speculation at the time in the newspapers. One of the reports from the local men who went out to the wreck site said that they found very little coal a lot less coal than they would have expected to find. And that becomes important because of the fast service. It had been known that these ships and their captains would try to shave off time as much as possible, and they would even take less coal in hopes of being able to reach their destination very quickly, and it would save weight. So there was one instance that had been in the newspaper not long before that. It wasn't the Allen line ship, it was another line. But the New York Times picked it up, the story, and ran with it, because this ship had been crossing the Atlantic, and they ended up burning most of their cargo just to make it, because they didn't have enough coal. So they had to burn their cargo. So of course the New York Times picked that up and ran with the story, saying that that was the answer. That the Allen line was sending their ships out with too little coal, and they had to cut off corners, and possibly, maybe that was the answer, maybe that's what happened.
But he also went out of his way to pick up passengers from a wrecked ship and whatnot, so.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and I mean, there was no, and that's the thing about this captain. I wasn't able to find every record of this captain, every instance of someone speaking about it, always said good things. There was never this captain like doing a little shady deals. He was one of the better or most respected captains in the fleets. So, you know, it's a possibility. Maybe that's what they were doing. And this is a quote from the Yarmouth Tribune on February 24th. How this disaster occurred will of course never be known, though there is little doubt that it had its origin in the reckless mania for accomplishing quick passages, which has already led to the loss of so many fine steamships and so many valuable lives. Either to incredible folly or incredible rashness, the loss of the Hungarian may be safely described. So this reporter is of the theory that it was the make it fast theory that was the reason that the Hungarian was lost.
And forget the February spring tide weather and whatnot.
Well, there was the report of it being off course off Liverpool. So, you know, who knows why it was off course. But it seems to have been off course. And this is just a picture of the monument down Clark's Harbour. And again, we've got in memory of the 205 men, women, and children who perished. So that's kind of what I know about the Hungarian, is I don't really know a whole lot. So I don't have any answers that maybe it was the coal, maybe it was because they were trying to make it too fast, who knows. I know everybody wants the answer to this question, it's what you came for, right? So what about Lizzie? Does everybody know the story of Lizzie? No. Everybody except Rachel?
I've read the story in the verses. Lizzie dies tonight.
Yes. Yep. Okay, well, I'll tell you the version that my grandfather told me. There was a diary that washed ashore, and the diary had entries in it of a young girl who had, from the US, she had gone to England for medical treatment because she was sick. And she had regained her health, and she was on her way back home, and the ship was lost. And the diary washed ashore, and the final entry in it is, the ship has struck, all will be lost, Lizzie dies tonight. So that's been the local story, or a version of it that most of us around Cape Sable Island have known, you know, grew up hearing that story, Lizzie dies tonight. There's no question that the story belonged to the Hungarian. We can tie it to that because it happens shortly after that this story came out. But whether or not there really was a Lizzie, her name, in some reports her name was Lizzie Loudon, but there's no Lizzie Loudon on the passenger lists. But that doesn't prove anything one way or the other. There are reports that there was no diary found. That was a postcard. So we don't really know. Like, we could say that I think the most the most common was that there was a diary. There's also the one that it was a postcard inside a dress. But anyway, we don't really know. We don't have a diary. Lots of people think it's at the Arts and Smith Museum. I hear that all the time. People tell me, oh yes, it's over at the museum. There's a diary. I wish. I really wish. But there isn't. But that doesn't mean anything either, because Sid Smith remembers his father telling him that Lizzie's uncle came from the States and picked up the diary. Possible. So maybe there was a diary, maybe there wasn't. We don't know. What we do know is we can't prove one way or the other, whether Lizzie was aboard the ship or Lizzie wasn't aboard the ship. In 2006, Bruce Nunn of CBC Radio, he investigated the story of Lizzie. And he concluded that the story started as a Sunday school story in New England, aimed at teaching children to be nice to your mothers because you don't know when you're going to die. That was his conclusion. Maybe he's right, maybe he's not. There is a book called Golden Ringlet, or Lizzie Dies Tonight, and it was published in 1865 by the American Baptist Publication Society. So there is a religious connection here. It was published as a religious piece of work. It's a whole book. It's not just a poem, it's not just a bit of a diary, it's a whole book. You can actually download it off Google Books as an ebook. I have downloaded it, and there is a copy, for anybody who doesn't have internet, there is a copy at the Cape Sable Historical Society in Barrington. So in 2006, Bruce Nunn won the Arts and Entertainment Reporting Gold Award for his story of Lizzie Dies Tonight. Still, like, to me, that still doesn't prove it's true. So, but I think it's likely that it is a story. That's my opinion. We don't really know. I do also know that Stephen C. Foster picked up the story, and there were lyrics written by Mary Byron Reese. And Stephen C. Foster, for people who don't know, wrote things like Camp Down Races, 911, or whatever it is, doo-dah, doo-dah. He wrote all those kind of songs, Oh Susanna, and so he was a very, very well-known songwriter, or musician, composer. And that music was published by Doubleday and Hammond in 1861. Now, somehow, I don't remember how I'm supposed to do this. This is the music. And before I do that, I'm going to disappear out of your frame for a minute. I've got the words, if anybody wants to follow along.
I've got the glasses up again.
Oh, come on.
You can read it, maybe you have to swell, but I do not sing.
I was just going to say, that's me.
That's what puzzles me. I don't know why Hungarian rock would be called Hungarian rock.
Good luck,
I can play it
honey.
a couple of times through and you can figure it all out.
Good luck, honey.
Okay, where's my notes? There it is. And I can't sing, so. Now, when I did this at the Historical Society of Barrington, we had singers.
low.
So low nobody can hear you. But if you read through the lyrics, you can see that the story of the lyrics is very similar to the story that I was told as a child. That there was this young girl who had gone away to be healed from some illness and was all healthy again and was coming back home to see mother. And that's very, very similar to the story we were told. So was the story that I was told by my grandfather, was that passed down through people who read the diary, or was it passed down because people heard the song? And the song would have been probably very popular because the composer and his music was very popular. So personally, Linda's opinion is that Lizzie didn't really exist, that Lizzie was made up. But I don't know that. I can't say that for sure. I have no proof one way or the other. But that's my thought.
Well, it suits the Victorian Bible thumping claptrap, basically.
So the last thing I have here on the Hungarian is a poem by Arthur Thurston, and he was from Yarmouth. A lot of you probably knew him as the Pigeon Man. He has written a book on the Hungarian, and I have a copy of it. And I think, Clyde, you have a copy of it. The next morning, when the sun arose and the angry billows swelled, the people of Cape Sable's shore a dreadful sight beheld. And who came there to see the sight? All who came there to see the sight, with heartfelt grief bemoaned the fate of those who left their homes to cross the ocean foam. And far from friends and home, in a foreign land to die, a stranger's home, their burial place, no friend to close an eye. And that kind of sums up the Hungarian. And I dedicate this to the memory of my mother, who was really compiled 99% of this research. And what she didn't compile, she forced me to. And that's simply my bibliography.
Here, here.
So what do you all think?
Great.
What's it?
I think the chair I brought down provided for this didn't float ashore. Ron will attest to that.
So how do you think that
I understood, Tyler told me he understood it had been salvaged from the wreck,
okay,
not purchased at auction or anything, but salvaged.
okay,
It was bolted to the deck, we know that.
okay, okay.
It was bolted to the deck.
Yes, the 3 feet are rather narrow, and of course the tip over was stable, but they had it bolted to the deck because it was a swivel chair, I suppose it had a bar or a table, and it could swivel around to get up and down.
So it must have been in the cabin, though,
Well, cabin or in the,
because it was upholstered.
It's hot. It's a bit hot. I got to say, Charlotte's a treasure. She's in the hall. She's got ready. Hopefully we'll get somebody.
Unless there's a name on something.
So, thank you, everybody.
he would have known, right?
Tea and coffee.
Thank you.
Check out the artifacts that are here. There are more artifacts of the Hungarian in the museum.
There's more. There's a mirror and there's a lot more.
I'm Mary I was married to Symonds, so my last name now is Symonds, but
And your first name is?
Linda. I'm Dolores's and Albert's daughter.
Okay, near Amsterdam.